Welcome to Trust Talk. Humans have a tendency to blame somebody or something else in the face of setbacks, accidents, or other negative situations. Today we are joined by Sidney Dekker, who explains why this instinct can have devastating consequences for organizations and their capacity to learn. When blame takes hold, people shut down, honesty and authenticity disappear, and the organization suffers. Sidney explores the profound impact of blaming, the benefits of a restorative justice approach, and how it can transform trust and accountability. He also tackles the moral dilemma of whether there are acts or people beyond the reach of restorative justice. We discuss practical examples such as recent events in the Netherlands and lessons from the Apollo 13 mission. Your host today, Severin DeWitt.
Sidney, it's wonderful to have you as our guest today. To kick things off, what inspired you to explore and write about the effects of blaming in organizations?
Well, first of all, happy to be here, Severin, and thank you for inviting me. I think the biggest driver for getting me to reflect on and then write alternative ideas about the effects of blame in organizations was indeed to see the devastating consequences of blaming, not just for the organization and for their capacities to learn. When you blame, you insert and engineer learning disabilities in your organization. People shut up, they stop being honest, you don't get truth-telling, authenticity disappears from conversations. We assume that people are or should be perfect, and if they're not, then we have the right to blame them. All of that, of course, leads to a climate that ultimately harms organizational outcomes, including organizational performance, organizational safety. But most importantly, it was, I think, compassion with the effects of blame on the individuals involved. I just couldn't see that and not act.
Well, we'll come to that in more detail during the interview. In your book, Stop Blaming, Build a Restorative Justice Culture, you describe how moving from blame to a more restorative, just approach can enhance trust, especially in the workspace. What made you want to tackle this topic, and how does your work build on James Reason's ideas from his 1997 book about just culture?
Well, first of all, the 1997 book by Jim isn't about just culture. It's about managing the risks of organizational accidents. And so it's got a very different focus. He's got a couple of pages in it in which he discusses this, where he talks about organizational cultures. And he's got various labels, including a just culture, where it sharply departs from, rather than builds on, those sorts of ideas, is that what Jim talks about in 1997 in those few pages in that Managing Organizational Accidents book is fundamentally retributive. It's a just culture that is based on rules, violations, consequences, and the idea that we can categorize behavior in various ways and say, if it is this, well, then it sort of deserves that sort of consequence. But if it is this, it certainly, we should be imposing these sorts of consequences on people. It turns out, a couple of years later, that those sorts of categorizations are incredibly subjective, very difficult to arbitrate in any meaningful or just way, and ultimately becomes a great device for HR and other parts of the organization to dispense blame in an organizationally or institutionally legitimate way. So to say that it builds on that would be, I think, a profound mischaracterization. I think it is the ideas of restorative justice, which aren't built around rules, violations, and consequences, but instead built around impacts, needs, and obligations, is so different that it lays out a completely new landscape of opportunities and possibilities.
Central theme in your work is the concept of human error. How do you think our understanding of human error needs to change to improve safety and accountability in organizations?
You're right, that is actually key and goes back to the earliest work of my graduate studies, and it was all about human error, which is a very slippery topic, by the way, difficult to define. But if we could boil it down very simply, and there's all kinds of formal words for it, and I can get back to those, but we have to assume that nobody comes to work to do a bad job. Let's start there. Nobody comes to work to do a bad job. One of my colleagues and friends, Todd Conklin, puts it beautifully. He says, people don't make bad choices. They are given bad choices. People have bad choices. That's the key shift. A key shift, by the way, which also Jim made back in fact, in his 1990 book on human error, that rather than seeing human error as the cause of our troubles, we should see it as the consequence of trouble deeper in an organization. That the fingerprints of whatever ends up being labeled as human error, the fingerprints of everybody else in the organization are all over this. It is not just the individual. And we're not just the custodians of an already safe system, right? So human error as a consequence rather than as a cause of trouble. The formal words for this, there's a lot of psychology underneath this, but it's typically referred to as the local rationality principle. What people do makes sense to them at the time, given their goals, given their knowledge, given their focus of attention or mindset. And so what we have to do is go back in and reconstruct that local rationality. Because if what they did made sense to them, it'll make sense to other people too, right? So that's the shift.
Just culture plays a role in various fields, like you said, in safety. Safety practices often focus on the sharp end of operations where errors and incidents are most noticeable. These practices usually blame individuals for mistakes, labeling them as violations or errors, like you just mentioned. You believe this approach is flawed because it ignores the broader systemic issues that contribute to these incidents. How do blaming culture and just culture lead to different outcomes?
Thank you, Severin. I mean, of course, the idea that we should investigate the systemic issues giving rise to the circumstances that set people up for failure is in itself by now trivial. Well, I hope it is trivial that we have been discussing this for so long. In fact, basically since the 1940s with the human factors pioneers, Alphonse Japanes and Paul Fitts and others, basically saying this already, that I hope we don't have to spend too much time on making that more explicit. But okay, so if that is true, if the goal should be to understand the deeper systemic issues underneath how we set people up for failure and or success, why does a blaming versus a restorative approach lead to different outcomes? I think very simply, a blaming or retributive approach is typically one that is top-down, that makes certain assumptions about what is right, what is wrong. There are rules, they should be followed. There's violations, right, which is an awful word to begin with, because it makes whoever calls it that right and whoever commits the violation wrong, right? So you've lost the battle to begin with. What happens in a blaming approach, obviously, is, well, many things, but one is that people will start ducking the debris, the fallout of a particular incident and not want to contribute to the conversation, which means that you shrink the number of stories that you get dramatically. In fact, you're often not really interested. One story is enough. If that is enough for you to blame or put the blame on a particular person, you can say, well, this person sucked, they screwed up, they should have done this, they should have zigged instead of zagged, and that explains the whole thing. That carries the explanatory load of our incident. A restorative approach actually is much more active in inviting multiple stories and voices into the conversation. As you do that, you get a much broader picture and often a much deeper picture of how long-standing conditions give rise to particular circumstances that set people up for failure, and that these things existed for a long time prior to the particular incident with which they showed up.
One of the more well-known examples of surviving a crisis through teamwork and problem-solving is NASA's Apollo 13 mission. After an oxygen tank exploded, the crew faced a life-threatening situation with limited resources and dwindling power. How would a just culture approach versus blaming help in managing such a high-stake incident, and what lessons can modern organizations learn from this example in terms of handling crises and building trust?
What a fascinating example, Severin. Thank you for asking. Let me lift out, I think, two key things that are consistent with the ideas that we've been discussing. The first is the trust that you give to the frontline operators, which is in some sense really cute to suggest that that was a sort of an active and deliberate choice in that case, which it wasn't, because nobody else could help. They, out there in space, had to solve the problem. The frontline guys had to figure this out. But it's an instructive example that once you do that, you actually can get really interesting bottom-up results rather than top-down saying, oh, here's what you should do. Here are the rules. Here are the protocols. Follow the crisis protocols and you will be fine. Of course, complexity theory would predict that none of that is going to work because crises throw all kinds of novelty and unanticipated and unpredictable things at you. So that's the first thing. Trust the frontline operators. I think the second thing in that particular example is very consistent with safety 2 or safety differently thinking, which is focusing on that which works. What is the key question that Gene Kranz down in Houston asks the boys up in the module? He says, tell me what is still working in the module. And I don't think those are the exact words, but that's basically what he wants to know. Tell me whatever system is still working. That's what he wants to know. And from there, you build your solution. This is vastly different from what we typically do in organizations, which is, well, what is broken? What has been screwed up? What's not working well? That's not the focus. The focus is on what is working, which is consistent with safety 2 thinking, which is safety is about the capacities and the things present that make outcomes go well. That's, I think, very instructive in Apollo 13 as well.
I understand that blaming typically doesn't help restore trust. However, in a situation like, for example, a dam breaking and flooding a large area, resulting in numerous deaths, and it is found that the government failed to maintain the dam properly, isn't it justified to blame the government? How do we handle accountability in such severe cases?
Interesting. You hide a lot of rather deep concepts in that question, Severin. First of all, I mean, the idea of accountability, right? Well,
that was unintentionally, by the way.
No, yeah, of course, that's good, and what that even means. But I think hiding underneath the question is the really difficult, the moral dilemma that we all face, which is, are there acts or are there people who are beyond the reach of restorative justice? What I mean with that question is, are some things so incredibly bad, so unforgivable, that we can no longer apply restorative justice? Of course, the whole notion of forgiveness and its relationship to restorative justice would suggest that nobody or nothing is in principle beyond restorative justice, except those who put themselves out of reach. What I mean with that is restorative justice is fundamentally a collaborative affair. You have to talk, you have to disclose the truth, you have to confess, you have to repent, you have to show that you are willing to atone, you have to tell the truth, you have to apologize, you have to show that you're taking actions in a way that is consistent with repairing the harm, mending the relationships, addressing the impacts, seeing to the needs that the incident has caused among the people affected. And in that sense, I don't think that a restorative approach is inconsistent with the idea of accountability, even in so-called severe cases, which is, again, I mean, it's a categorization and a label that we might slap on certain things. But what I mean with that is you can make accountability into a forward-looking property, as Ginny Sharp says. We can make accountability forward-looking by saying, okay, what do we need to do now? And whose obligation is it to do that? That is a question that's hugely consistent with restorative justice. So in principle, no, I don't think that cases like the one you mentioned are beyond the reach of a restorative approach.
In your article, Restorative Just Culture Checklist, you mentioned the significant improvements in stakeholder inclusion and incident responses. Can you share us some practical examples of how restorative justice has positively impacted organizational safety?
One of the most important contributors that we saw in that study, Severin, was the multiple contributing stories. To put it simply, you learn much more. As an organization, you learn much more about what has driven you to the brink of that incident if you take a restorative approach. That was one of the most important contributors. In addition to that, and that's not organizational necessarily, but to the stakeholders, in this case it was hospitals, so they included patients, caregivers, families, even insurers. Many of them felt heard in a way that made them much more collaborative and willing to contribute to seeking solutions, rather than, oh, well, how are we going to avoid getting blamed next time, and staying out of the conversation. So that was another really important contributor.
I'd like to ask you a philosophical question, if I may. Immanuel Kant's work often explores the concept of moral responsibility, particularly in his Metaphysics of Morals, where he discusses holding individuals accountable within the framework of duty and moral law. How does Kant's perspective relate to your views on building a restorative justice culture?
You have picked one of the more difficult and inscrutable philosophers for your question, actually. I mean, if we'd gone for Bentham or a consequence ethics philosopher, or if we would have gone for somebody interested in virtue ethics, it may have been more straightforward. Kant is famously difficult to decode. However, there's a few things that I think are consistent. The first is that I believe, but I'm happy to debate people who know more about Kant, but that when Kant speaks of moral law and duty, he is relatively open-minded, how these things are set in time in a particular context. What I mean by that is if you have to hold people accountable within a framework of duty, the notion of duty in that is negotiable. What is your duty? Is it your duty to not harm others? Is it your duty to save as many as possible? And so I think there is flexibility and space for negotiation in that. But I think even more importantly, whereas Kant says, consistent with other philosophers like Hannah Arendt, that you cannot undo the past, right? That, as Hannah Arendt says, is die Unwiderruflichkeit, das Prädikament der Unwiderruflichkeit, the predicament of the irrevocability, of irreversibility. You cannot undo the past. However, he says, that doesn't mean that you cannot undo the relational consequences of that past. And that, I think, allows, even through Kant, a beautiful opening into restorative practice.
Recently in the Netherlands, several organizations have had to respond to incidents of inappropriate behavior, including swearing, employee conflict, and sexually inappropriate conduct. These situations have highlighted the significant impact that organizational responses can have on workplace trust. How do the approaches of blaming culture and a just culture differ in addressing such behaviors, and what are the implications for trust within those organizations?
I think the best way to reflect on that for us and for the listeners is to take this back to the different ways of thinking about human error. If we want to focus on just the front line and the behavior that happens there and intervene in that behavior and say, okay, we need to make that behavior go away, we need to stamp it out, we need to make sure that that never happens again. And so we're going to set an example by firing or sanctioning or somehow dealing with the people who expressed such behavior. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't. I'm not saying that you cannot fire people or separate yourselves from them or go different ways. However, as soon as you do that, you have some questions to ask because somebody hired them, somebody promoted them, somebody supervised them, somebody managed them. Lots of people worked with them. And so it's not as if the fingerprints of other people are not on these persons who give expression to these sorts of behaviors. Again, the question is, do you want to focus on the sharp end act and to think that you can meaningfully intervene there by, as Jim beautifully said, right, swatting the mosquito? Or do you want to go to the swamp and say, we might need to drain this thing because we'll just keep producing this sort of behavior? We have to ask much deeper questions. The conversation needs to broaden out. What I mean with that is sexism doesn't just show up in an individual person, right? Inappropriate behavior, swearing, the anomie, as Durkheim would have called it, right? So the reducing and erosion of norms which govern social behavior. Those are much larger sociological phenomena that require a broader approach. What's concerning, I think, is that even within democratic systems, we seem to lean to elect governments that make such conversations less possible, less legitimate, and seem to revert to a more judgmental, domineering type of discourse. And so rather than us rescuing ourselves from it, it seems as if we're doubling down on leaving such behaviors in place and legitimating them. That's concerning.
Sidney, as a last question, trust is core to our podcast and also a recurring theme in your extensive body of work, from exploring just culture and human error to restorative justice and safety. How do you see the concept of trust connecting all these areas, and how has your understanding and experience of trust in your professional research influenced your personal life?
I have found trust to be a commitment to believing in the goodness of other people that is based on very few data points and huge leaps of faith, which can be a dangerous combination, or a foolhardy one, a stupid one. However, in my own experience, it has been violated only very few times. And if you trust other people, which itself comes from a position of compassion, of empathy, of wanting to understand their position and their perspective, and in fact being interested in how they see the world and thinking that we can learn more from it ourselves as well, there are no limits to what we can do collectively. I think that that has certainly informed my professional direction and my personal life as well. So, and of course, yes, it connects fundamentally the ideas of safety differently, of restorative just culture, in ways that probably deserve more books, more stuff to write, Severin.
Well, knowing and reading what you have already written, I think that's something that you continue doing, right?
Probably.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, Sidney, thank you very much for spending your precious time to talk with me for the Trust Talk podcast. Hopefully you have a wonderful stay in the Netherlands and a safe trip back to Australia.
Thank you, Severin. Happy to do it.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Trust Talk. We hope that you found the conversation valuable and informative. At Trust Talk, we believe in the power of trust to create positive change in the world. If you believe in our mission, we would greatly appreciate your support. You can help keep Trust Talk going by making a donation on our website at trusttalk.co/donate. Every contribution, no matter how small, helps us to continue bringing you thoughtful and engaging podcasts. Thank you for your support and for listening to Trust Talk. We look forward to meeting you again for future episodes.